The dust settled on everything that mattered, a fine red powder coating the memory of her husband's hands and the wood of the home they had built together. Agnes stood motionless under the oppressive glare of the afternoon sun, her shadow a stark, shrunken thing on the parched earth. Before her, Mr. Finch adjusted the collar of his town coat, a garment utterly unsuited for the heat but perfectly suited for the statement he was making. His boots were polished to a high shine, reflecting the distorted image of the small, weathered farmhouse he was about to claim. The deed, he had called it, a piece of paper that held more power than the sweat and years she had poured into this soil. The townspeople watched from a respectable distance, their faces a mixture of pity and relief that it was not their door he had darkened today. Their silence was a verdict in itself, a heavy blanket that smothered her last hopes for an ally. "The debt is long past due, Agnes," Finch said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real emotion. It was a simple statement of fact, as casual as remarking on the relentless heat. He did not look at her, but at the horizon, as if already calculating the yield of the land once she was gone from it. "The bank is not a charitable institution." "You've had more than enough time," she said nothing, for what was there to say? Words were flimsy things against the iron certainty of his position. She could speak of the failed rains, of the fever that took her Samuel, of the promises made and broken, but they would be just sounds, scattered by the dry air. Her gaze drifted to the small, fenced-off plot behind the house where a simple wooden marker stood. Samuel was there. The paper in Finch's pocket could not claim that, at least. But it was claiming the ground around him, erasing the life they had shared until only a solitary memory remained, an island in a sea of another man's property. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, a feeling far more chilling than the day's blistering temperature. It was the stark, lonely terror of absolute displacement. She had nowhere to go. This small patch of unforgiving land was her entire world. "You have until sunrise," Finch concluded, finally turning his eyes upon her. They were small, calculating eyes, the color of faded currency. "Take what you can carry. The rest is forfeit." He turned and walked away, his polished boots leaving crisp, definitive prints in the dust that had belonged to her just moments before. The sun rose the next day like a raw, open wound in the sky, spilling crimson and orange across the silent plains. Agnes did not watch it. She had been moving since the first hint of grey light, a ghost in her own home. She moved with a methodical slowness, a strange calm settling over her grief. There was no room for tears, they were a luxury she could not afford. Her possessions were pitifully few. A heavy wool blanket, a cast-iron skillet, a small sack of flour, and the clothes on her back. And the pigs. 2 young sows, all that remained of the livestock Samuel had been so proud of. They were small but sturdy, their grunts and squeals a grounding, living sound in the profound silence of her departure. She tied a rope to each and began to walk, not toward the town, but away from it, toward the jagged, sun-bleached hills that loomed in the distance like the bones of some long-dead creature. The townsfolk would have expected her to beg, to seek shelter with a neighbor, to become a ward of the church. But she carried a core of pride as hard and unyielding as a river stone, and she would not give them the satisfaction of witnessing her collapse. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the moisture from her throat. The pigs protested, pulling against their tethers, but she trudged onward, her focus narrowed to the next step, and the one after that. Hours bled into one another. The farm disappeared behind her, then the town itself became a mere smudge on the horizon. She was entering a different world now, a place of rock and scrub and silence, where the rules of men like Finch had no meaning. Desperation was its own kind of map. It led her to a fissure in the rock face, a dark opening that promised shade. It was a cave, its entrance partially obscured by a tumble of ancient boulders. A cool, damp air, smelling of stone and deep earth, breathed out from the darkness. It was a primal, instinctual pull. She untied the pigs, who immediately trotted into the gloom, seeking refuge from the relentless sun. Agnes followed them, stepping out of the searing light and into a world of profound shadow. The temperature dropped immediately. The silence within was different from the silence outside. It was a living, breathing quiet, the sound of the earth's own heart beating slowly in the dark. It was not a home, but it was a beginning. She lived that way for a week, a creature of twilight, venturing out only in the cooler hours of dawn and dusk to forage for edible roots and berries, learning the harsh rhythms of the wilderness. It was on one of these excursions that she met him. He moved with the quiet fluidity of a shadow, and she did not see him until he was standing just a few yards away, his presence as natural and unassuming as the ancient junipers that clung to the rocks. He was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and time, his eyes holding a deep, steady calm. He carried no weapon she could see, only a canvas sack slung over his shoulder. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her worn dress, her determined expression, and the two pigs rooting contentedly nearby. She tensed, her hand gripping the handle of her skillet, the only defense she had. He merely nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. "That cave," he said, his voice raspy, like stones grinding together. "It drinks the water from the high peaks. Goes deeper than you think." He was Isaac, a man who lived on the fringes, more a part of the landscape than of the town that barely remembered he existed. He was a trapper, a forager, a man who spoke the language of the seasons. He saw not a destitute widow, but a survivor. Over the next few days, he appeared again, always unannounced. He never offered charity, but something far more valuable, knowledge. He showed her the slick, dark moss that grew only where water seeped from the rock, leading her deep into the cave to a hidden spring that trickled into a clear, cold pool. "Water is life," he stated, as if imparting a sacred text. "For you, for them," he pointed a gnarled finger at the pigs. He taught her to identify the bitter roots the pigs could fatten on, the tough, leafy greens they could digest. He showed her how to build a better smoking rack for the meager strips of jerky she made from snared rabbits. He spoke in short, practical sentences, his wisdom stripped of all sentimentality. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows from the hoodoos, he looked at her growing pigs. "Town's got a short memory," he observed, "but winter's memory is long. And winter is a hungry beast. You feed them well, they'll feed you when the snows come." The idea took root in the fertile ground of her desperation. It was more than just survival for herself. It was a plan. A future. A quiet, hidden act of defiance against the man and the town that had cast her out. Isaac had not given her a handout, he had given her a purpose. The days shortened, the relentless heat of summer mellowing into the crisp, golden light of autumn. Agnes's life found a new, arduous rhythm, dictated not by a clock, but by the needs of her growing animals and the demands of her self-made world. The cave was no longer just a shelter, it was becoming a sanctuary, a hidden homestead carved from rock and shadow. Her hands, once soft from tending a small garden, were now calloused and strong. She worked from before dawn until after dusk, her muscles aching with a satisfying weariness. She hauled countless buckets of fresh water from the hidden spring, the repetitive motion a kind of meditation. She spent hours foraging on the hillsides, her sack growing heavy with the specific roots and wild goods that Isaac had pointed out. The pigs thrived. They grew fat and sleek in the cool, protected dark of the cave, their contented grunts echoing off the stone walls. Agnes had constructed sturdy pens for them, not with neat planks of lumber, but with a painstaking arrangement of fallen rocks and scavenged, sun-bleached branches dragged from miles away. It was a fortress of necessity, ugly but effective. Her world shrank to the dimensions of this secret place. The smell of damp earth and livestock became her perfume. The flicker of her small, carefully managed fire was her only sun. She felt a strange sense of ownership, a deeper connection to this stone refuge than she ever had to the wooden farmhouse that had been taken from her. Down in the valley, the town of Providence carried on, its daily dramas playing out under the vast, indifferent sky. She was a ghost to them now, a forgotten footnote in the town's ledger of minor tragedies. They had no idea that just a few miles away, in the heart of the unyielding hills, a woman they had discarded was quietly building an ark, not of wood, but of flesh and bone and sheer, unadorned will. The passage of time was marked by the slow, steady expansion of the pig's girth, a visible, tangible measure of her success. They were her treasure, her insurance policy against the coming cold, a secret harvest that no man with a piece of paper could ever seize. Down in Providence, the first signs of trouble arrived not as a dramatic storm, but as a subtle withering. The cornstalks in the field stood brittle and stunted, their ears small and poorly formed. A creeping blight had turned the potato vines black almost overnight, leaving the tubers rotten in the earth. The long, dry summer that had baked Agnes out of her home had also scorched the valley's hopes for a bountiful harvest. At first, the mood was one of sour disappointment. But as autumn deepened, disappointment curdled into a quiet, gnawing anxiety. Mr. Finch, however, remained a beacon of unconcerned optimism. Standing on the steps of his mercantile, he addressed the worried faces of the townspeople. "Hard times build character," he announced, his voice projecting an easy confidence that rang hollow in the dusty air. "We must simply tighten our belts and demonstrate the resilience for which this community is known." It was easy for him to speak of resilience. The doors to his own large storehouse were thick and bolted, and everyone knew it was filled to the rafters with grain and salted meats, purchased cheap from farmers in greener valleys. His wealth was not in the soil of Providence, but in his control of its commerce. The whispers started in the evenings, in the dim light of the saloon and over kitchen tables. Prices for flour and beans at Finch store had crept up, a penny here, 2 pennies there. It was subtle enough to be denied, but steady enough to be felt. Families began to measure their meals with more care. The blacksmith, a large man named Thomas, spoke for many when he muttered to a neighbor, "His belt ain't got no new notches in it." The contrast was stark. While the town began to starve in slow motion, beset by a failing harvest and a predatory merchant, Agnes was hauling the last of the season's wild bounty back to her cave. Her pigs were enormous now, their presence a warm, living promise against the encroaching chill. She could feel the change in the air, a sharper bite in the wind that swept down from the high peaks. She knew, with an instinct she was only now beginning to trust, that the hungry beast Isaac had spoken of was about to awaken. The first snow came early and without warning, a silent, determined siege that began in the dead of night. By morning, the world was transformed, buried under a thick, immaculate blanket of white. It was beautiful for a single day, a pristine and peaceful landscape. Then it kept snowing. For a week, the flakes fell, sometimes a gentle dusting, other times a blinding, horizontal blizzard. The town of Providence, nestled in its valley, became a prison of cold. Drifts piled up against doors and fences, swallowing roads and landmarks until the entire world seemed reduced to a few familiar rooftops and the rising columns of smoke from chimneys. That smoke became the town's lifeblood, a visible sign of who still had wood to burn, who was still fighting. But as the weeks wore on, some of those columns grew thinner, and a few disappeared entirely. The supplies in Finch's mercantile, once a symbol of security, were now a source of bitter resentment. The shelves emptied with alarming speed. The last sack of flour was sold, then the last barrel of salted fish. Soon, there was nothing left but overpriced tins of peaches and jars of pickled beets, luxuries no one could afford and which offered little sustenance. Hunger became a constant, unwelcome guest in every home. It hollowed out faces, shortened tempers, and filled the unnaturally quiet streets with a palpable desperation. Children's laughter, once a common sound, was replaced by a persistent, fretful silence. In the bitter cold, sickness followed, a dry, hacking cough that settled deep in the lungs and refused to leave. The town doctor had little to offer but grim advice and watered-down laudanum. Meanwhile, deep within the earth, Agnes was warm. The immense thermal mass of the rock around her held a steady, cool temperature, impervious to the blizzard raging outside. The body heat of the now massive pigs turned their section of the cave into a steamy, almost tropical grotto. The smell was rich and earthy, the smell of life. She had her own stores, sacks of dried roots, smoked rabbit jerky, and the living larder of her 2 enormous animals. She was isolated, utterly alone, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly secure. The world outside could freeze, but in her hidden kingdom of stone and shadow, she was the undisputed queen. The breaking point for the town came on a fiercely cold afternoon when the sun was a pale, useless disk in a steel-grey sky. A small group of men, their faces gaunt and their shoulders hunched against the wind, made their way to Mr. Finch's fine, 2-story house at the edge of town. It was the only home where the windows still glowed with the warm, steady light of multiple lanterns, a stark beacon of his prosperity amidst their shared misery. Thomas the blacksmith led the delegation, his big hands clenched into fists at his sides. The doctor was with him, as was the town's preacher, their presence meant to lend an air of civility and desperation to the confrontation. They did not bang on the door but knocked respectfully. Finch himself answered, a stark silhouette against the warmth and light spilling from his home. He looked well-fed, his face full, his clothes immaculate. He listened to their plea with an expression of mild impatience, as if they were children complaining of a scraped knee. Thomas spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Mr. Finch, we're not asking for charity. We're asking you to sell us the grain from your personal storehouse. At a fair price. Our families are sick. We have nothing left," the doctor added, his own voice thin and weary. "People are wasting away, sir. This cough, it takes hold of the weak. Without proper food, more will die." Finch let the silence hang in the frigid air for a moment before he responded. He drew himself up, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "I am truly saddened to see the spirit of this town fall to such depths of dependency," he began, his tone that of a lecturer scolding his pupils. "My personal stores are for my family and my business interests. They are the result of foresight and prudent management, qualities you would all do well to cultivate." He paused, letting his words sink in. "To simply give it away, or even sell it now, would be to reward a lack of planning. It would breed weakness. You must learn to stand on your own 2 feet with that." He closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of absolute finality. The men stood frozen on his porch, not in anger, but in a state of stunned clarity. The illusion was shattered. Finch was not their leader, he was their captor. And he had just locked the door to their cage. A strange thing happens when a community is stripped of all false hope. It begins to look for real hope in the most unlikely of places. The memory of the town had been deliberately short concerning the widow they had allowed to be cast out. She was an uncomfortable subject, a reminder of their collective inaction. But in the depths of their desperation, that memory was dislodged. It started with a child, the blacksmith's young son, who claimed he'd seen a wisp of smoke rising from the impassable hills weeks ago, before the worst of the snow had hit. He'd been told it was his imagination. Then another man, a hunter, recalled seeing strange tracks near the old rock falls, tracks that weren't from a deer or a coyote. The whispers coalesced into a single, improbable idea: Agnes. Was it possible she had survived out there? The thought was absurd. No one could survive a winter in those hills with nothing. Yet, the rumor took hold, fed by the complete absence of any other option. It was a desperate gamble, a sliver of a chance in a world that had run out of them. Thomas, his face set with a grim resolve born from Finch's rejection, decided to act. He gathered 3 other men, the strongest left in the town, men whose children were beginning to show the hollow-eyed look of true starvation. "We're going to look for her," he announced, his voice low but firm. "It's a fool's errand, maybe. But it's better than sitting here waiting to die." The journey was a brutal ordeal. The snow was waist-deep in places, forcing them to break a trail through an endless, blinding expanse of white. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that clawed at their exposed skin and stole the breath from their lungs. They were retracing the path Agnes had taken in the summer's heat, but their journey was one of supplication, not of exile. They were humbled by the very landscape she had been forced to conquer. After hours of grueling travel, guided by the hunter's vague memory of the tracks, they found it. A dark opening in a rock face, almost completely hidden by a massive snowdrift. And from a small, cleverly concealed fissure above it, a faint, almost invisible trail of smoke was rising into the freezing air. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through them. They were about to find the ghost of Providence. The men cleared the snow from the entrance, their movements clumsy with cold and anticipation. Thomas, holding a single lantern, was the first to step inside. The air that met him was a shock, not the biting cold of a dead cave, but a wave of warm, humid air thick with the smell of earth, hay, and living animals. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, the scene that slowly materialized before him was so unbelievable it felt like a hallucination. The cave was vast, a natural cathedral of stone. In the flickering lantern light, he saw 2 enormous pigs, larger than any he had ever seen, resting contentedly in a meticulously constructed pen of rock and timber. Beyond them, he could see sacks neatly stacked against a wall and strips of meat hanging from a rack near a small, smouldering fire pit that vented its smoke through the crevice above. And standing by that fire, holding a long, sturdy stick like a scepter, was Agnes. She was no longer the frail, defeated woman he remembered. The months of hardship had stripped her of any softness, leaving behind a creature of lean strength and absolute self-possession. Her hair was wild, her face was smudged with soot, but her eyes were clear and steady. They held no fear, only a calm, watchful intensity. She did not speak as the other men crowded in behind Thomas, their expressions of awe and disbelief comical in the dim light. They looked from the massive pigs to the well-stocked cavern, and then back to the woman who had built this impossible kingdom. "Agnes," Thomas finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. We didn't know." She remained silent, her gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft grunting of the pigs and the crackle of the fire. It was a silence that held all the power, forcing them to confront the magnitude of what they had done, and what they were now here to ask. The blacksmith, a man of immense physical strength, suddenly felt small and weak before her. "The town is starving," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Finch has closed his doors to us. We have nothing. We came to ask, to beg. We have some money, what little is left." He held out a small, worn pouch. Agnes looked at the pouch, then back at his face. Her expression did not change, but a flicker of something, not triumph, but a deep, weary sorrow, passed through her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment, not with vengeful glee, but with the grim certainty of a prophet whose direst predictions had come true. Agnes let them stand there for a long time, letting the warmth of her sanctuary and the sight of her impossible wealth sink into their cold, hungry bones. She wanted them to understand. Not just her survival, but the depth of their failure. Finally, she spoke, her voice lower than they remembered, roughened by disuse but clear and firm. "Your money is worthless here," she said, her eyes sweeping over their desperate faces. "What does a coin buy on this mountain? Does it keep the cold out? Does it fill an empty stomach?" She took a step forward, the firelight carving sharp angles on her face. "The last time I saw you," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the cave, "you stood silent while that man took my home. You watched me walk away with nothing but the clothes on my back and these two animals. Your silence was your vote. You all voted for Finch, and Thomas had the decency to look ashamed." He lowered his head. "We were wrong, Agnes. We were cowards." She gave a short, mirthless laugh. "You were practical. It was my debt, not yours. My suffering, not yours. That is the way of Providence." She walked over to one of the enormous pigs and ran a hand along its broad back. The animal grunted in contentment. "But now, his storehouse is empty for you, and my cave is full. And suddenly my suffering has become your business." A long pause followed. The men held their breath, awaiting her judgment. They were entirely at her mercy. They had come expecting to find a victim they could rescue or barter with. They had found a matriarch in her own sovereign territory. "I will help," she said at last, and the collective sigh of relief from the men was a gust of wind in the still cave. "But not for your coins. And not for Finch." She laid out her terms, her voice ringing with an authority they had never heard from anyone. The meat would be a gift to the town, not a sale. But she would oversee the butchering and the distribution herself. Thomas and his men would do the heavy work, under her direction. Every family would receive a share, based on need, not on status or wealth. Her word would be final. It was not a negotiation. It was a decree. They agreed without a moment's hesitation. As they prepared to make the first trip back with a share of the life-saving meat, leaving two men behind to help her, Agnes had one final condition. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice devoid of malice, cold and clean as the mountain spring. "He gets his share, same as everyone else. But I want you to deliver it to him personally, Thomas. I want you to look him in the eye when you tell him who it came from." The winter did not break for another 2 months, but the town of Providence did not break with it. The steady supply of meat from Agnes's cave, distributed with unwavering fairness, kept the sickness and starvation at bay. She became a figure of legend, the cave widow, her story whispered around firesides. She never returned to live in the town. She remained in her stone fortress, a ruler in voluntary exile. Finch was broken not by force, but by irrelevance. His hoarded grain, which he finally tried to sell when he saw his power vanish, was left to rot. No one would buy it. The community, forged anew by shared hardship and a shared savior, simply ignored him. They had a new economy, one based on the quiet strength of a woman they had cast away. In the end, it was not a story of revenge. It was a story of a different kind of justice, one that grows not from anger, but from the slow, steady cultivation of life in the darkest of places. The harshest winter had not destroyed Providence, it had merely stripped away everything that was not essential, revealing at its core the simple, profound truth that true wealth is not what you can lock away for yourself, but what you can provide for others when they have nothing left.